Well, thanks, Alex, and thank you to the organizers for pairing us with Mark's talk. This is really exciting session for us to be part of. I'm Marina, and my collaborator Helen Zhao and I are excited to talk to you today about a couple of questions we've been thinking about hype in scientific communication. And we're trying to ask first what we can learn about the pandemic science communication situation from philosophical work on hype, but also what we can learn about how we should try to theorize and investigate hype empirically from a case study having to do with the pandemic. And what we're going to try to argue today is that the uptake and amplification of hype really depend on context, not just what's said in a particular utterance or instance of scientific communication. And so we want to offer what we call a looping account of hype, which can better accommodate both the causes of hype and the effects that hype uptake and amplification seem to have in our case study. And we suggest that the looping account can actually better capture an agnotological role for hype, or a role for hype in producing ignorance about some important questions and lines of inquiry. So to start out, we want to offer you Kristen Intemann's definition of hype, which we quite like. And Intemann argues that hype is an inappropriately optimistic exaggeration. And this can be communicated explicitly or implicitly. And importantly for her, appropriateness and exaggeration are both sort of matters of value when it comes to arbitrating these. And so these are going to depend on the audience, among other factors. So with this notion of hype in mind, hype has been a really important part of conversations about scientific communication in the context of the pandemic. Hydroxychloroquine is probably the most familiar sort of poster child for hype in the COVID context, where a drug was advertised as much more effective than we had evidence to support our expectation that it would be, and the risks were really downplayed, and the certainty was really exaggerated. So this is a case that seems to meet Intemann's criteria and illustrate what we can do with this diagnosis of hype. But hype has also been a sort of higher level worry about communication in the context of the pandemic, partly because a lot of publishing is happening on preprint servers where non-expert audiences have access to publications that haven't been through a sort of critical check or other sort of procedure, and partly because we are starting to see multiple cycles of hype that are leading people to approach new proposed therapies with the worry that they might be hyped. So this is kind of what we see in the case of ivermectin, which I think turned out not to be as effective as some had hoped and advertised, or at least that's the impression that I got from Miriam Solomon's talk yesterday. So hype is a real problem in the context of the pandemic, and it's a good sort of place to be looking if we want to try out this machinery for thinking about hype and what we want it to do for us. Okay, so there are a few sort of standard accounts on offer that can help us to think about this, and these are our starting points for working with hype. One which Intemann offers in her recent paper is a diagnosis that the problem of hype is really a problem about how science is communicated by a range of potential actors. So this can include scientists, science journalists, academic institutions, and so forth. And this emphasizes kind of the dissemination angle of hype. So the communication by a range of actors side of it. Also, part of this conversation is a sort of deficit model of scientific communication. So an assumption that the exaggerated claims of hype get undue uptake and are harmful because non-expert audiences lack the skills or the information with which to properly interpret expert findings. So the idea is that non-experts are particularly vulnerable to hyped claims because they don't know much about science, or because they have a kind of misconception about how science works. And finally, the sort of standard diagnoses offer an idea of what's wrong with hype in terms of a failure to achieve a very particular goal of scientific communication, namely transferring true beliefs from expert to non-expert audiences. So the idea is that an important goal of scientific communication is to get non-experts to believe something like what experts believe, and hype interrupts this or corrupts something about this process. So these are some interesting starting points for thinking about hype. But when we look at the case study that I'll tell you about momentarily, we find that this can't quite be the whole story. So here's what we want to argue. The case of biological sex differences research and COVID-19 shows that hype actually really depends on not just dissemination, but also contextual uptake. So this, I think, probably has some affinity with what Mark wanted to argue about how we interpret generics, but basically the dissemination of scientific information isn't sufficient for hype. And the success conditions for hype actually really depend on things like audience beliefs and expectations as well. The success conditions for hype can also allow it to play this kind of obfuscatory or agnotological role, so it can obscure other lines of inquiry. And hype actually can play a role in the successful achievement of some goals of scientific communication. So we want to sort of expand the set of legitimate goals of scientific communication beyond the transfer of true beliefs to include things like generating enthusiasm about science. And Kristen Intemann and a number of other philosophers of science have argued that this is a perfectly legitimate goal of scientific communication in some contexts. And hype can marshal enthusiasm in a very effective way. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about this case study of sex differences research in the context of the pandemic, because this is what we are sort of starting our thinking from. Early on in the pandemic, we saw a number of reports that there was a sex disparity in COVID mortality between males and females. And because public health organizations often collect data and disaggregate it exclusively according to binary sex categories, it's underdetermined whether this is a disparity according to biological sex, so having to do with like physical characteristics enabling sexual reproduction, or whether it has to do with gender as a product of social relations, or a combination of the two. But it's called the sex disparity, and this gets a lot of uptake. So we see headlines like, why are so many more men dying from coronavirus? And very quickly, this disparity gets cashed out in terms of and attributed exclusively to biological sex differences. So male sex is identified by global COVID-19 meta-analysis as a risk factor. Biological maleness becomes this risk factor for severe disease and mortality in the case of COVID. Even though it's not clear that this inference straight from disparity between males and females to biological sex differences as an explanation is really well warranted. But that's not the focus of today's talk. The point of this is that these claims move very quickly to sex-specific therapies being recommended for treating COVID. So we see, for instance, in an immunology sex differences paper, the authors recommending that vaccines and therapies to increase immune cell responses to COVID might be warranted for male patients, whereas female patients might benefit from therapies that dampen innate immune activation early during disease. And right alongside this, we see early recommendations of sex-specific vaccination programs and the like. So recommendations that we treat COVID with everything from progesterone, estrogen therapies, anti-androgen therapies, the works. And this move is really quick and not super well supported by the evidence. It mostly relies on plausible mechanisms by which biological sex differences might produce the observed disparity between males and females. So in order for this to work as a case study for us, I need to convince you that this is the case of hype. And to do that, I want to try to convince you that the optimism about sex-specific treatment programs, is unwarranted and exaggerated, and it's inappropriately so. And to do this, I'll just show you a few headlines. So this this problem gets cashed out as a battle of the sexes. It gets cashed out in very essentialist language. And immediately we are asking, can estrogen and other sex hormones help men survive COVID-19, right? These are actually the popular claims, some of the milder claims that we see. In the scientific literature, we see claims like Premarin, which is an estrogen-related drug, is just capable of stopping the COVID pandemic. And I'll add that this is in actually an opinion piece, has no original data to support it, which is characteristic of a large swath of COVID-related publishing. Actually, don't have original evidence. So this is like an obviously hyped claim, and not all claims about biological sex-related treatment strategies are hyped. We're not trying to say that biological sex differences aren't real or worthy of inquiry or interesting or good targets for clinical interventions, but claims about biological sex differences as a basis for interventions are widely hyped in this context. And if you don't believe us, believe the other scientists who are criticizing these programs, like this sort of snapshot at the bottom, right, where these scientists are saying our colleagues are presenting extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence in this journal, in fact. So there's a lot of sort of follow-up controversy on the merits of these claims. So they're being advertised with a lot of optimism, a lot of certainty on the basis of limited or only sort of plausible mechanistic evidence or just so stories. And the whole conversation about the sex disparity in COVID mortality shifts toward this conversation about sex-specific interventions despite this lack of evidence. So we're diagnosing this as an instance of hype. Okay. But we're not just diagnosing it as an instance of hype, because we want to say that this really shows something about how hype is working in this context. And that's the following. Hype sometimes depends not only on the exaggeration that's coming from the dissemination side of things, but it also depends on making kind of pre-existing audience beliefs and attitudes salient. So a number of philosophers of language have proposed different ways this might work. Jennifer Saul calls it activation. Mary Kate McGowan says it's making certain facts permissible to take into account, right? And in this case, we think that a number of these claims depend on activating beliefs about biological sex essentialism. And Mark, I'm really curious if you have any thoughts about the relationship between generics and essentialism, because we do see a lot of generic claims about women and claims like men and women have different immune systems. That's maybe like on the milder end of the spectrum here. But in this case, it really depends on activating these beliefs about biological sex essentialism, by which we mean the popular belief that biological sex is the primary factor underlying differences in health outcomes between men and women. So it's assuming that these biological sex differences are universal, but also more importantly, that they're relevant and that they're kind of totally explanatory in this very satisfying way. So this image is from the cover of Immune Matters, which is the magazine of the LaCroix Institute and Immunology Research Center. And I think it like really captures part of what's going on in this conversation, which is that the relevance of biological sex differences is taken to be just absolute. And they're supposed to be explanatory in this really magical way that kind of depends on activating beliefs about biological sex essentialism. But that's not all, because this motivates us to think about the role that these audience beliefs might play in not just like original uptake of hype, but also the circulation of hyped claims. So in the case that we have been thinking about, it's not that the original disseminated claim just goes out into the world and gets uptake, but it gets taken up and recycled. And these claims kind of travel beyond their original context. So you can say like the secret lives of hyped claims, except that the whole point is that it's not a secret, right? And these audience background beliefs and background attitudes can mutually reinforce and support the original objects of scientific communication. So a scientific claim is hyped in terms of biological sex essentialism, right? Men are from Mars, women have better immune systems, and audiences already have popular beliefs, and I should say not just popular because scientists talk this way and have these beliefs, right? But audience beliefs are the sort of landing for these claims, and they contribute to sort of reinforcing one another in a feedback looping type of way. So that's why we're advocating moving toward a looping account of hype, because our example makes us think that it doesn't really make a lot of sense to just talk about hype as something that's disseminated, when in fact the success of hype in doing things like marshaling excitement for scientific research or generating enthusiasm, but also in just securing this kind of uptake, it really depends on not just like an initial output, but on hype being taken up in a particular way and being recirculated maybe beyond its original context. That's sort of the point sometimes. And so we are talking about that in terms of success conditions. Very briefly, this helps us think a little bit about the harms of hype beyond the failure to transfer true beliefs from one communicator to an audience, whether that's a non-expert or another expert audience. And one of the things we're really worried about with hype is the eclipsing of alternative explanations. So I told you about this alleged sex disparity between males and females in COVID mortality. This conversation has focused overwhelmingly on biological sex differences as explanations for that disparity, but we haven't really been talking as much about social relations or the interaction between social relations and biology as candidate explanations for this disparity. So this is kind of eclipsed, say, gender in this conversation. And that's one thing we might worry about, but also the way that the original claim is hyped, presenting this disparity as universal and robust and stable phenomenon disappears alternative explananda as well. So it turns out that the sex disparity in COVID mortality is actually highly variable across contexts like location and social groups. In this figure from our colleague Tamara Rushevich's paper, we see that, for instance, in the state of Michigan, Black women have much higher mortality rates than white men, for instance. And the gap between Black males and females and white males and females is very different in size, as you can see here, right? And this is just a couple of contexts, right? We can compare Michigan and Georgia. It's actually really difficult to make these comparisons because data disaggregation practices are highly variable and really frustrating. But the point of this is that no one is asking about how this sex difference in mortality varies across contexts, because when it's presented in terms of biological sex essentialism, it is taken up as universal and repeated as this kind of stable, robust phenomenon instead of being challenged or nuanced in this way that we think is pretty important. And finally, when we think about the way that hype works in terms of its sort of broader circulation and uptake, we can see how this contributes to diverting resources away from competing research programs. So for instance, when we think about alternative explanations that get eclipsed here, right? The work on biological sex differences certainly diverts attention away from explanations that appeal to social factors. And this is really a serious worry when we're diverting resources away from criticisms. So our colleague Michelle Frank has this really nice phrase where she says, you know, the biological sex differences seem to just expand to take over the whole possibility space. And when that includes your critics, you lose that important social epistemological machinery, right? And you might really worry, if you're amenable to that kind of argument, that when you eclipse your critics, you really put yourself in a sketchy position, maybe epistemologically. And so we might worry about how hype perpetuates this harm. And we think that, you know, these could work in a number of different and complex ways. We're not trying to say that the looping account is true of all instances of hype, but we do think if these are serious worries, that empirical work on hype should attend to uptake as well as to the kind of dissemination side of things. And this is something that we're really interested in. Okay, so hopefully what I've convinced you, or at least laid out for you, is that uptake and amplification of hype really depend on context. And sometimes this context includes background beliefs like biological sex essentialism. Our looping account hopefully can accommodate some of the causes and effects of this, so some of the ways that this works, and also the way that hyped scientific communication can actually amplify and perpetuate maybe pernicious background beliefs. And we hope that the looping account can move us toward a way of talking about this agnotological role for hype, or this role for hype in producing knowledge deficits, not just failing to transmit knowledge appropriately. So thanks a ton to the organizers for this really fun and overwhelming week, and to our colleagues in the Gender Sci Lab who have a teaching module about COVID if you're interested in working this, especially if you teach philosophy of science, philosophy of medicine.